The painting that you're going to see in this particular demo is a combination of watercolor, gouache, and some casein on Arches cold pressed paper. Now, I don't always do a drawing. It just sort of varies. I never know what I'm going to do until I actually get to a particular subject. Some subjects require fairly complex drawings, others, for me at least, none at all. And a lot of it depends. Am I doing an illustration for a magazine where I've got something specific that I've got to do, a caricature or something like that? Or is it a broad-based landscape? It just sort of all depends. In this particular case, I wanted to do a little bit of drawing just because there was a lot going on, and I just wanted to get a little bit of placement. You can see I didn't get particularly involved in the drawing. It was more just a few well-shaped, well-placed shapes so that I would know generally where my largest shapes were. You'll notice also that when I begin a watercolor painting, very often I splatter it. Just, a lot of it is just to loosen up, lighten up, and get into the fun of watercolors. There's nothing, I'm not trying to be cutesy with it. I've seen people that do all sorts of silly stuff that it's for show, and that's fine. I mean, if that gets you through the night, then okay. But for me, I don't do anything that doesn't have a specific purpose. And with watercolor painting, it's such a fun medium. Watercolors kind of do their own thing, and if you can sort of sit back and allow it to do that, then it'll paint itself. And oils, caseins, gouache, these other any opaque, stiffer mediums, they're not going to do that. Whatever you put down, that's where it is, and that's where it stays unless you move it. But with watercolor, you put something down, and one color will bleed over into another, and it's just so fun because it's doing its own thing. But if you learn how to sort of control it a little bit and not get uptight about what it's doing, then again, it will very often paint itself. The other thing I love about watercolors is that it lends itself so well to soft edges. It's real easy with full-bodied paints like oils and full acrylics to just get all these hard, chiseled out edges. And with watercolors having a propensity towards bleeding into one another, it really helps you to put a color down, put another one adjacent to it, and as those two colors begin to bleed into one another, then they create a soft transition that helps all the different shapes relate to one another, and you don't just have a patchwork quilt of things. Now, for the most part, unless I change, I'm assuming eventually I will, I'm using one brush. It's a Chinese calligraphy brush. It's old. It's kind of beat up. I have better, but this one, it serves me well. It seems to do the trick. Now, if I do have to get into sharper needle-like points or something, then I'll swap over. But so far, I mean, this thing's sort of holding up. It wasn't a particularly expensive brush. It was some cheap thing my wife bought just as a fun little happy, probably for my birthday or anniversary or a stocking stuffer or something, and it was just some no-name, nondescript brush, and it sat in the package for years. I just thought it was kind of cool, and I never really used it. And then one day I thought, well, I'll try this thing, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And as I've said on many of my other videos, I have no idea what I'm doing. I did this painting probably months ago, and between then and now, I've done many paintings, many illustrations, portraits. and I'm coming back and doing voiceovers, so I'm kind of watching this thing unfold just like you are, and my comments are just sort of as things pop into my mind. You will notice, earlier I had put in the silhouette of these trees dark and then dropped in the lighter color, and it bled over and created the highlight, or the light area, not the highlights, but the lit area. And that's one thing I want to point out. Generally, people say, if you paint in oils, you paint dark to light. If you paint in watercolor, paint light to dark. Well, I reject that out of hand. I paint basically from the middle out. Midtones are what constitutes the overwhelming majority of most paintings, and if you get the midtones right, then you've done most of your job. So if you get those right, then you can lay that in, carve in your shadow, drop in your lights, and except for maybe popping in a couple of accents, you're done. And I love that. And unless you're working strictly using only transparent colors, then watercolors have their opaque colors, and you can drop in one which will, especially the heavily sedimentary colors, they will push other colors out of their way. And that's where you can take and put down a dark silhouette, drop in your lights, and it'll push those darks right out of the way and makes for a wonderful transition. You did see a jump in the video, and that wasn't an editing choice necessarily. I actually got busy, got distracted, got up, had to do something. When I came back, I'd forgotten to turn the thing on, and I caught it, so I painted a little bit, but that's okay. You can see I'm sort of layering, putting in my darks and building out. If you can limit yourself to, say, 3 values, that's really the trick. My goodness, a painting that's really light, midtones, and darks is so much stronger, has so much more visual impact than a painting that's just overly rendered. It just has more robustness to it. It makes its statement so much more clearly. Now, I will tell you, I'm not counting those couple of really light highlights that have been popped in. I'm not talking about that. So if you've got, say, that white or off-white highlight on the tip of a nose or the tip of a chin or something like that, I'm not talking about that. Those are just little accents. And also in the darks, if you've got these little bitty dark shapes that just make an area pop, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about looking at a subject and having it be broken into 3 distinct value patterns: light, medium, and dark. What you want to do is, I think it's referred to as value grouping, so that you look in your shadows and you might see 2 or 3 or so different values. We'll group those together. And in the midtones, you'll see 2 or 3 values. Group those together as one. And in the light, instead of having 2 or 3 values there, group them into the light. And so now, instead of 9 values, you got 3. Now, this isn't a moral issue. You're not being judged morally. It's just a visual issue. And I will tell you, the reason value grouping is, from a visual standpoint, so important is that what can happen is you get into the light area and you see all of these subtle values and all this stuff going on. Well, what do? You start trying to render every single one of those. And what happens is that as you do it, you get darker and darker and darker. And pretty soon, your light area is as dark as your mid-tone. And sometimes it'll even go as dark as your shadows. And by the same token, you can do the same thing in your shadow area, where you'll start seeing all of these values. Because your eyes are so sensitive, you'll see all these values and you start putting them in. And what happens? Your shadows then get lighter and lighter and lighter, and pretty soon your shadow area is as light as your light toned area, and your light toned area is as dark as your shadow area. And what we wind up with is what's been referred to as the mid-tone mumbles, where nothing is really articulating itself. Nothing is really letting people know who it is, what it is, and what it's all about. Everything's just sort of blah, 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 just mumbling. You don't know what's being said. You can't distinguish one shape from another, and it's just a mess. And that's where I say, if you can take your subject and reduce it to 3 values, you will have a far stronger painting. Now, with this, I didn't stick with traditional watercolor techniques. I rarely do that. If I can, I do, but I'm not particularly wed to it. So that's where I started grabbing my gouache colors and started putting them in and articulating what I wanted to say with okay, I apologize for the interruption. My wife came home with groceries, and so I had to stop and help her unload. And so hopefully the video won't be too thrown off. I'll try to catch it if I can. I know I was talking about using opaque colors. I use gouache and casein because I don't want to take the time and effort to preserve the whites of the paper or anything like that. So I will go in and just use the opaques. Plus, I sort of like the way it looks. And that's what you'll see me doing throughout the rest of this painting, is then applying the opaque colors that I want to use and sort of going back and forth. I do talk to my students about dabbing and tell them that of all the things that I see student painters do, dabbing is possibly the worst. And it's because it makes for tentative, weak looking paintings, and just it makes a mess. I mean, just dab, 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 dab. There's no structure. The painting just sort of falls apart. You can also wind up with a textured patchwork that makes a sky look like it's tiled or something. So I always tell my students, use as big and bold a brush strokes as you can get away with. But then later, if I'm doing something like azaleas or whatever, that's where I'm hesitant to call it dabbing, but I will put in smaller brush strokes. And if you want to call it dabbing, that's fine. But certainly what you will see me near the end of the painting doing is I'm adding in these individual leaves or flowers. I certainly don't start that way. And the only reason that I or anyone who's got sort of a dabbing technique in their painting, the only reason that that works and that the painting holds together structurally as a whole is because they laid in first broad structural areas that hold the painting together. Then they came in, and on top of that, they added these dabs of details. One thing you got to watch when you're doing foliage is symmetry. It's easy to just do everything as a bunch of little lollipops or something, and even a really well kept garden, there's going to be some asymmetry in there, and that's what makes it interesting. And if you do see an area that's just nothing but, I don't know, a series of lollipop hedges, it's probably not worth painting. It's probably visually boring and will make for a boring painting. So anytime you see things being overly symmetrical, look for ways of breaking that up. The same thing with foliage. You want to be careful about you painting things. If you've painted pinholes through bushes or trees into the sky, and you do it on one side, then coming over to the other side and doing the exact same thing, it's easy to do that. Our brains are geared towards symmetry. We like symmetry. And it's like when you walk into a room and you see a picture hanging a little bit crooked, there's just this innate desire to go in and straighten it up. It's the same thing in paintings. It's real easy to put some strokes down on one side and then automatically feel like, to balance it out, that you need to put the same number in the same place on the opposite side. So you want to watch that and look for ways to break up your symmetry, make them have as much variety as possible. Okay, well, I think that's enough for this one. I'll just put on a little bit of music and let you finish out this painting. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode of The Arthropologist, please hit the like button. And if you'd like to see more episodes like this, think about subscribing. I'm Bill Wilson, and I'm The Arthropologist.